Hello, and welcome to this Skill Me Up Expert Talk episode on well-architected framework.
Hi, I am Shannon Keene, and I am a senior cloud advocate on the Enterprise Platforms and Tools team. Over the course of my career, I've worked with a number of different enterprises trying to get them ready for the cloud or just ready for new technology. I have gravitated towards the cloud, and now I get a chance to talk to a lot of audiences to prep them with the right info to move forward and adopt the cloud successfully.
And my name is Dwayne Natwick. I'm a cloud training architect lead at Opportunity and Skill Me Up. I'm also a Microsoft Azure MVP. I spend my days creating content, training others as a Microsoft certified trainer and a regional lead for that program on Microsoft Azure and 365 technologies. And you can find me on the social media links provided on the slide. So today we're going to cover a topic that we didn't get into fully in our last expert talk episode, which is the cloud adoption framework governance model. And that really is going to tie us in and bring us right into the well-architected framework. So we're going to go over the well-architected framework, what goes into the Microsoft well-architected framework reviews, and then talk some things around some tools around cost optimization. So I'm going to start talking here. Let's talk about the cloud adoption framework governance model. So as we look at the cloud adoption framework governance model, we talked about the cloud adoption framework in our last talk, in our last episode. But what we need to do as we go through and work through our cloud adoption, one of the steps is continual optimization. And so around that, we have to have some level of governance in terms of what we're utilizing in terms of our corporate policy, our disciplines for support, as well as understanding, what we have to do for compliance, our business, what our risks are within our business, and then establishing our processes to continually monitor. As we recall from the cloud adoption framework, there was the continuous monitor and management piece that goes along once we have adopted our Azure technologies and have moved in and migrated to Azure. So when we look at that, there's 5 disciplines of cloud governance, and this wraps really well with the well-architected framework because we have our cost management, we have our security baselines, we have resource consistency, our identity baseline, which is key to even just our planning and adoption part of moving to the Azure environment, and then our deployment acceleration. So what are we going to do to centralize and create a consistent and standardized environment across our deployments, utilizing templates and utilizing, as we'll talk about here shortly, the well-architected framework. And it's important as well to have a team that is that cloud governance team that is, has cloud architects and allows everybody to think about this governance and how these pillars of cost management, security, identity, consistency, and resources all are maintained and are utilized to accelerate our deployments. I think Shannon and I will turn it over to you to talk a little bit around this execution of governance.
Sure. So I think the big takeaway from this slide here is we don't want enterprises to build a governance end state, right? So the cloud is ever evolving. And if you were to start right now, you probably wouldn't solve for everything out the gate, right? The idea is to build upon governance incrementally, where you formulate an identity strategy, a network strategy, an encryption strategy, baseline strategy for the way that your resources are going to be created. And this actually helps you build upon what comes next in terms of the actual implementation itself, right? So when you go through all of this process, all the process pieces, you get to the point where you're documenting everything and you're flexing those muscles and you start to centralize those artifacts, right? So you start small, you establish the foundation that you can quickly evolve as cloud adoption and cloud governance mature. And then, a big want in the part of this is to mitigate tangible risks. So you'll want to think through all of the compliance requirements you have to make sure you adhere to, or the security requirements you have to adhere to. This is where you lean on different tooling to start to outline that for you. Risk evolves as well, right? So as additional iterations of cloud adoption are planned, the risk profile tends to change. And when you lean on that cloud governance team, or you establish that cloud governance team, that team is really the team to help champion and move that forward. So they're the team that monitors adoption plans to identify risks and that evolve with your corporate policy statements. So when we think about the native actionable governance, there's a number of tools like Azure Blueprints, Azure Policy, Azure Cost Management, Azure Advisor, Azure Security Center, Azure Sentinel, etc. Right? You can even lean on things like RBAC, and you can think about built-in RBAC or building out a custom RBAC role. You can also think about leaning on ARM templates as well. So, we want to think about automating as much as possible out the gate so that we can think through what this environment will look like without having to reconfigure it each time, right? We want consistency, and these native tools start to help. So I think last week I had talked about the idea that, you want to ensure your resources are named correctly, that they have the right tags, that engineers aren't deploying the wrong things, et cetera, right? So you can lean on Azure Policy to help. You can think about this like engineers will probably see the red text of death or see the error messages when they try to deploy certain resources. That will course correct things very quickly for those engineers, and they won't make the same mistake twice. So those types of tools help you build out what the governance is going to look like. So then that starts to fit into the business risks, the policy and compliance, and then the actual process you use to manage cost management, the security baseline, the resource consistency, the identity baseline, and the deployment acceleration. So these tools essentially augment, and they're native to the Azure platform. And then when we think about integrating third-party tools, so there's a lot of multi-cloud running around in the world at large, right? Companies don't want to have vendor lock-in. They don't want to just live in Azure. They want to live in Azure, AWS. They want to still have on-premises workloads. They also maybe want to explore what GCP or Google Cloud Platform offers. So you can think about these tools that can be deployable or usable within any cloud, right? So all of the HashiCorp technologies, so Terraform, Vault, et cetera, right? You can think about using Splunk to help out from a monitoring perspective. It'll monitor your environments on premises. It'll monitor your environments in AWS as well as Azure. You can bring that into Azure without a lot of issue. You can think about bringing some of your ITIL-based platforms like ServiceNow into Azure. You can think about Nagios as well. There's a Nagios component here that could come into the mix if that's something that you've built out on premises. You've got the skill set on premises and you want to take into Azure. The beauty here is there's a lot of different tooling that you can plug in to help your governance policy. And it's one of those things, if you really have spent the time and you've evolved the skill set on premises, you can think about continuing that skill set into Azure by deploying these third-party tools. And it really comes down to, it'll help augment, and understand business risks, the policy and compliance, and then help establish the process so that your actual disciplines are met, right? So that your cost management is thought through, that your security baseline is something that's adhered to, that your resource consistency matches throughout all of the subscriptions and resources you're deploying, that your identity baseline matches up to what you would hope from a identity as kind of the new perimeter, right? That's a new kind of security model that changes with the cloud. And then this all helps deployment acceleration. So ultimately, plugging in these tools and plans, they help you evolve your risk-driven decisions. So as a company, you get to kind of keep that big picture in mind, but you get to align tasks based on immediate and tangible risks. So, when you think about this, you've got a number of different phases, right? A number of different releases, so to speak. You've got kind of version 1.0, version 2.0, version 3.0, et cetera. And, the idea here is you continue to predict, you continue to evolve, you continue to change based upon new services, new resources, new platforms being able to be plugged into Azure. So each release represents a continuum of activities from planning to completion. So releases often span multiple iterations or an effort of sprints. So during the planning, the team, the cloud governance team, should be able to articulate a fairly accurate description of the assets involved, the workload criticality, data classification, deployment approach, and budget. So these will change maybe release by release, but these are close enough to help you start to frame up what that governance plan will look like. And then when we think about the execution of the incremental governance, so, during release planning, the cloud governance team will seek to understand the release plan so they better understand integration and integration points, right? So, when will the release be completed? What risks are introduced with this plan? What needs to change in order to mitigate the new risks? These are great starting questions. What that then happens, or what it takes into consideration, is this evolutionary trajectory, right? So the cloud governance team, they'll be able to start digging in deeper and ask those deeper questions. A lot of times technical debt is not really understood by the cloud governance team, so they have to go lean on other teams, especially middleware teams that manage these applications. So this is where you start to uncover what the technical debt looks like when we have to think about things like, how resilient does this application have to be? How does this application have to be up all the time? What is the life cycle of this application? Like, when does it get the evolutionary components? When does it go through upgrades? When does it go through patching? So all of this tends to help related to the ways in which everything kind of meshes together. So, you kind of scratch at the surface from the cloud governance team, and then from there, you kind of move forward and you iterate and expand upon as you think through your incremental governance plan.
Yes, let's talk about the well-architected framework now that I'm not on mute. All right. So we're going to go through. Let's discuss what this is and what we're talking about when we mention the Azure well-architected framework. For those of you that probably may not have have the term in your vocabulary or necessarily understand what it is, and when we talk about well-architecting an environment within the Azure ecosystem, we generally talk about workloads. And when we talk about workloads, what we're talking about is a independent, as the definition states on the slide, an independent service or collection of service that does something. So, think of it as you have an application that you need to get into the Azure environment, and everything that goes along with building that application within Azure is that workload and what you're going to have and what's going to provide the value to meet your needs. So and understanding that workload and understanding how then you're going to utilize and compartmentalize those workloads to migrate those workloads into Azure is very important as we start going through our cloud adoption as well as our well-architected framework. So when we think about architecting and thinking about these workloads, what we need to think about is how we're going to architect and optimize these workloads and be successful within the Azure environment. And it's looking at best practices. It's having the confidence that we're going to use those best practices. We're going to find workloads that are actionable and simple at first. When we're talking about the cloud adoption framework, we were talking about migration and lift and shift or transformation and modernizing applications or workloads. It's how we're going to do that. What is the actionable workloads that we can build in terms of our framework to migrate to the cloud, and then as well, if they are just lift and shift type workloads, are there places and abilities to optimize those workloads and how we can focus on that as we move into our cloud adoption. We don't want to move workloads into Azure if it's going to cost us more in Azure than it costs us in our own data centers. But we need to think about that, and we need to have our eyes on that ball and understand that moving forward. What the business drivers are and what the reasons are for us to be moving those workloads to the cloud. And so the Microsoft well-architected framework then provides that guidance and some of those architectural best practices that are utilized by both architects, solution owners, and engineers to improve that quality and to have the eye on what we can do in terms of a best practice approach to architect those workloads for cloud adoption. And the 5 pillars that Microsoft has built and looks at is cost optimization, operational excellence, performance, efficiency, reliability, and security. And if you go back to the first section of slides where we were talking about the cloud adoption framework governance, a few of these were mentioned and brought on in terms of those in terms of that governance area as well. The cost optimization, the security, and our performance is all going to be something we want to look at, and we want those workloads also to be very reliable. So as we go through and talk about each of these pillars and look at these pillars in further detail, you need to keep in mind, just think about and remind yourself of these pillars for a well-architected framework and how you as an architect or a solution owner, an engineer, are going to architect and design your workloads for the Azure environment utilizing these 5 pillars. And Shannon, I think you're going to go through a little bit deeper what each of these pillars address within the well-architected framework.
Correct. So when you think of these 5 pillars, there are a set of actions you can hope to achieve as an enterprise, right? So from a cost optimization perspective, the principles surround developing a cost model so you know exactly what you're going to be looking at on a month-to-month basis or even hour-to-hour basis. Sometimes workloads only get spun up for a series of hours. You'll be able to create budgets and alerts, which really helps related to thinking through not spending as much as you would think you'd be spending, or to at least optimize and plan correctly. From there, you get to review kind of the cost optimization checklists, so that becomes a piece of this, to ensure all stakeholders understand the path forward related to cost. So when you think through operational excellence, we want predictability. So you need to kind of select the right instrumentation tool. You'll have the right data collection components already set up to understand performance and resource health. You'll know where all of this data will be kind of retained and stored long term. And then all of this leads to better analysis, diagnosis, and visualization. So you can think about plotting out what this looks like in terms of dashboards. So by way of going into the cloud, a lot of these enterprises are realizing that there's a bunch of data that winds up getting generated, and you get capacity to think about all the different ways you can visualize that data to understand and make predictions and to build out better, more resilient environments. So a lot of this exists within the Azure platform outright from a native perspective. You can also lean on other tools as well, but this is another piece to think about as you come up with kind of the operational excellence pillar. When you examine the performance efficiency, we're looking for scaling efficiency, right? That's the big key here. So you can increase capacity and increase resources on demand or based upon a trigger, right? So if you are thinking about demand getting a cycle or an uptick, you could think about that just expanding and scaling out without having to worry about it, right? So, the business logic you'll have to decide upon as a team or as that cloud governance team. But remember, the cloud governance team is also working with different business units. So then you think about the ideas of how to be able to scale up and scale down on demand. You could even think about building the right design patterns surrounding auto scaling, right? So, running background jobs, when and how much to cache, implementing any sort of, CDN, right? And implementing a partition strategy. This all becomes important related to the efficiency of your resources. Reliability is another pillar in the framework, so it really focuses on resiliency and availability. So despite all the abstractions that going to the cloud helps with. Workloads on Azure still live on hardware, and we do still have to plan for what happens in the event of a failure, right? So you'll think about building out applications in environments where, like, maybe you'll build out an availability zone. So you'll spread that workload between multiple data centers in one specific region, and then you'll have some sort of DR plan as well with a paired region that's not in close proximity to the region, right? So you want to think about that. You may want to think about leaning on certain tooling like Traffic Manager. So in the event of a regional failure, you have a Traffic Manager component that'll be able to make your application up and online without any sort of issue, right? You want to think about that because of the fact that you can't ever predict when things are going to happen, but you can think about implementing the right design practices, the right design patterns, and the right design guides to help you make sure that your environment stays up and online when you need it the most. So the last pillar surrounds security. Enterprises want to protect themselves from threats the best way that they can, and this is really focusing on identity first and foremost. So identity is the new perimeter. So you'll adopt a pattern of least privilege. You'll be able to provision the environments accordingly. And then you'll think about things like enforcing MFA, making sure that risky sign-ons are being tackled. So if I'm in Chicago and all of a sudden my login is seen in China or somewhere nowhere near Chicago, sometimes even it might get flagged if it's New York, right? You may want to be aware of that. So you can think about bolting on native technology to give you more visibility. When it comes to, infrastructure and applications, so you'll think about restricting network flow or restricting the ways in which resources can access networking applications. So maybe you'll think about leaning on private link or service endpoints. Then you'll think about data sovereignty, right? So that's a big part of this as well. If you've got a specific set of compliance regulations that you need to adhere to, and that data can't traverse geographic boundaries, that's something you'll want to build into the well-architected framework. You'll want to tackle in the right regions to give you the right design patterns for you to think about what that application would look like without needing to worry about, oh gosh, I just deployed it, now what, right? So you can think about implementing that as well. And then from an encryption perspective, a lot of our services now are living in this realm of customer provided keys. So you don't have to think about leaning on Microsoft managed keys. You can really control the ways in which your data is encrypted and the keys in which to access that data. So there's a lot of interesting components here that help build out that well-architected framework from an Azure perspective. So these are the best practices to kind of drive that workload quality. So, when you think about cost optimization, we'll want to lean on Azure Hybrid Benefits, reserved instances. You'll shut down VMs when they're not in use. You'll resize VMs based upon looking at things like Azure Advisor. Maybe you'll even move your application to PaaS, right? It's not an easy process, but it gives you an opportunity to think about realizing what that value is going to look like on an hour-by-hour or month-by-month basis. When you think about improving kind of the operational components of this, you'll lean on DevOps, right? So you'll think about the right ways to deploy the resources, to monitor the deployments, and you'll think about the ways in which you can have that cadence, right? Because you'll want to constantly reevaluate, does this application meet all the needs for everything out the gate? And then from there, you want to think about some of the ways in which to enhance the efficiency. So you'll design for scaling, you'll monitor performance, you'll continue to evolve upon what this is going to look like. And then when you think through kind of the predictability, so you'll want to make sure everything matches up to the ways in which that you would hope they would, right? When you come up with this design pattern, you want to make sure that everything kind of becomes that cookie cutter approach, sort of, to some degree. You want to make sure that, the requirements are properly defined and outlined in some sort of policy. From there, you'll want to test simulations and you'll want to force some failovers just to make sure everything bounces back as planned, right? You want to make sure that the ways in which you deploy are consistent. You may want to kind of get away from manual processes of next, right? Maybe you want to have something deployable in a template or a script. And then from there, you want to make sure that you're monitoring the health and that you're able to respond to failure and disaster by way of monitoring your environments. So again, this kind of helps formulate what that plan is going to look like. And then when you think about kind of the security sides of this, identity and access management are important, right? So you want to make sure that you have a strong IAM policy. So MFA, you want to make sure that there's a least privileged sort of access model. Maybe you want to think about risky sign-ons, conditional access, etc. That's where the identity and access management comes into play here. You want to think about infrastructure protection. So you want to possibly think about availability zones, maybe stretching that environment with the traffic manager in front. Maybe Azure Front Door is a better suitable resource to pick. Then you want to think about kind of app security, right? You want to maybe only give certain levels of access to different parts of the application. You don't want to have somebody have contributor rights to the entire environment. Doesn't make sense. And then you'll want to think about, data encryption, data sovereignty, and then kind of the security operations of the mix here too. So these are all kind of the best practices that help you drive the right workload quality. So some business decisions will definitely influence workload architecture decisions, right? So things like uptime, SLA guarantees, labeling an application mission critical, right? So these are thinking through kind of that constant state of iteration. You may want to start optimizing costs inside dev environments first. Maybe you want to just tackle dev environments to begin with. Many enterprises are still brand new to the cloud and they're flexing muscles they didn't know they needed before. So you may want to take the time to build up the right muscle set to move forward and continue to evolve your cloud adoption skills. And you may want to experiment some more, right? So you may want to test some theories. And so the development workloads are great candidates. What that then builds upon is moving into your mission critical workloads. So by the time that you have really got a good handle on all your dev environments, you should be able to migrate and move those mission critical workloads and have the same effect because you will have experimented, kind of stubbed your toes, so to speak, had some issues with deployments. You'll have ironed all of that out so that when it comes to that point of moving the mission critical workloads, you can think about being able to deploy it with a seamless sort of experience. And also too, if you think about it kind of incrementally, you'll move to that notion of being able to secure the workloads properly. You'll have experimented, you'll have built out the right skills earlier on in the process so that by the time it actually gets to production, you'll be able to have this notion of being able to secure the workloads. So, the context will sort of dictate the trade-off, and a lot of customers tend to focus on this very iteratively. They'll start with those dev environments and move on through the mix. And by the time they're getting to production and they're making sure that everything's matching that right security baseline, they're seeing themselves in a much different light, and they're a much more robust light. So let's move on into the well-architected review itself. So
Yep.
was this?
You're going to go through the architected review. Yep.
Okay, cool. So last week when we spoke, I think you might remember there's a number of assessments you can take advantage of related to plotting out your adoption efforts. So I know we hit on like the cloud adoption framework as well as some of the cloud journey components. The well-architected review sits in the same assessment spot as the other assessments. It's another web-based assessment tool that helps improve the quality of a workload by examining that workload across those 5 different pillars of the well-architected framework. So the assessment also provides specific guidance that hopefully improves architecture and helps enterprises overcome detected hurdles effectively. From there, kind of the well-architected framework proactively focuses on the pillar where the most attention is needed. Prior to all these assessments and frameworks really existing in this world, there's a lot of guesswork, a lot of overanalyzing, a lot of not so great prescriptive guidance. Now we have it formalized in these great assessments that sort of help lend themselves well to examine the workload, provide the guidance, and then kind of be able to help you proactively focus on the areas you need to in order to improve and really match up to that well-architected framework.
And these reviews, you can kind of use those tools to do them yourself, as well as you can bring in Microsoft resources to also kind of bless them and look at them and verify them as well, right, Shannon?
Correct. Yeah. So usually, your account team is very well aware of where you are related to your adoption efforts. If you've got, a technical resource and some sort of resource that understands the needs of the business, those are great resources to bring in. And what they'll do is they'll help you think about how this would evolve and how this would continue to move forward. So these are great assessments to share with your Microsoft account folks. The well-architected review itself, so this is kind of quick screenshots of what you see. You'll get your overall results. It'll label you where you stand, right? And I've seen a lot of customers fall on a lot of different parts of this continuum. It's not the end grade, right? You're not actually measured based upon where you fall the first go around. In fact, you can rerun this down the road. And I always recommend doing that because things evolved and change, and you might want to figure out where you land related to the well-architected review. I don't know if you can see the operational excellence over here too. This is where you'll get all the recommended actions, and these will help you kind of by drilling into the specific sides of our documentation that either give you more of why it matters or show you how to configure it. So that's a really cool reality related to the assessment. So the review results work like this. So let's take an AKS environment, right? You'll run through an assessment. You'll review the results. Those results help you build out a cost model, and that helps you get to a kind of a budgetary estimate. So I think all of this becomes really helpful if you're thinking through how to move yourself from left to right related to agility and mobility and kind of giving yourself a better ground to move into related to your cloud adoption. And then I was going to run through.
I think you're going to show some of the screenshots and how
Correct.
this stuff works, right?
Correct. So let's see. Oh, so I can't. Okay, so I can share now. Hang on. Okay. So let me know when you can see it. Looks like you can.
Yep. Got it.
These are the assessments that we had talked through last week. So I thought it might be kind of fun to go through one of these. So Dwayne, let's pretend you're the customer. Right? And we can name this whatever we want to, but I'll leave it as is, right? So if I was coming to you, Dwayne, and I, was trying to help your company out, what were the areas you might be most interested in digging into?
Well, I think I'd probably speak for every customer that cost optimization is important, and I think security and performance efficiency. Let's go by those three.
Cool. So now you can always come back and you can rerun this with operational excellence and reliability. So click on next. Now, these videos are really helpful. I'm not going to play them right now. They're kind of the cover letter, so to speak, related to each one of these sections. So, what actions are you taking to optimize cloud costs? We could just say none of the above because maybe we're so brand new to this. I mean, what do you think, Dwayne?
Can you read them? I don't see them.
Sure.
In my screen a little bit.
let me make
or zoom
bigger.
In a little bit.
Yep, I'll make it bigger.
There we go.
Oops, maybe that's too big. So yeah, so identify opportunities to reduce overall cost.
Yeah, let's look at that one, and let's look at use cost management tools.
Okay, cool. Then we'll go to next. Let's see. We've got how do you ensure the cloud resources are appropriately provisioned?
Let's use configure auto scale policies. And select the right resource offering size. And let's just use those two.
Okay. And how big is your organization, how is your organization modeling cloud costs?
Let's just do estimate and track my costs.
There you go. How do you manage the storage footprint?
Let's see what none of the above does on this one.
Hey, I've experimented with this. It's interesting. So how are you monitoring your costs? Are you just watching it?
Yeah, let's just do watch.
Let's just say we're watching it.
Yep.
So then, what trade-offs have you made to optimize for costs? So certain data center locations are sometimes cheaper, like say from a VM perspective. It's not insanely different, like it's not, hundreds of dollars different, but it's ever so slightly different. So do you think we should maybe pick that, or what do you think? Maybe.
Yeah, let's pick that one. Take advantage of appropriate subscription offers.
There we go. So dev test subscriptions, that might be relevant. And then how are you designing your workload to scale? So as traffic fluctuates into your application, the amount of underlying resources that you need will vary over time. A lot of this seems to be a little bit more advanced than where some of our customers are. So we could just say none of the above.
Yeah, let's do that.
Then how are you thinking about performance? So, maybe you're using ARM templates. maybe you've got the right level of monitoring to be able to think about bottlenecks.
Yeah, let's understand bottlenecks, and what's the one above that? Policies to scale.
Cool. And then, so this is, let's see. So ensure you have the strategy to optimize resource use, maximize throughput, maximize response time, and avoid overloading any single resource. So maybe you want to run your tests at peak load.
Yeah. And what's the next one? Awareness.
Okay. Yep. I'm cool with that. So performance efficiency. How are you ensuring you have sufficient capacity? So maybe this one, have a strategy in place to manage events that may cause a spike in load.
Yep, that's a good one.
And then
scaling policies. Maybe the fourth one down.
There you go. Want to leave it at that?
Yeah, let's leave it at that.
Okay, cool. So how are you managing your data to handle scale? So let's see, modern business systems manage increasingly large volumes of data. Data may be ingested from external services. So maybe optimize database queries, document plans for data growth, maybe? What do you think?
Yeah, yep, I think those sound good.
Those two? Okay. I think these are usually, I feel like somebody's already in the cloud and they've been hanging out in the cloud for a little bit. Yep, maybe that's where I think those are a little bit more kind of like, yep. Mm-hmm. So let's see, how are you monitoring to ensure the workload is scaling appropriately?
Monitoring strategy.
Okay. So now we're down to security. We've got a handful more questions to answer, and then we'll get a nice, awesome report. So let's see, what design considerations did you make in your workload regards to security? In regards to security.
Let's see, follow best practices. Let's see that one.
Okay, and what about maybe authenticate via identity services where you can?
That sounds good.
We can just kind of move forward here. Let's see, what considerations, this is kind of a lot. So what considerations for compliance and governance do you need to take, right? So maybe monitor.
Yep, identity risk, penetration, right below that. Security best practice, yep. Any others that stick out? Let's see.
I worked with an enterprise prior to Microsoft that made this be a big, huge thing. So we can
only access,
check that one in. Yeah.
Resource locks. So.
Let's see. Wait, yeah. So I think that's
do audit and enforce policy compliance right above.
Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. I'll do that. Let's see. How are you managing encryption for this workload? Now, granted, remember we're focusing on one specific workload, right? You do this maybe workload by workload. You could always think about just adopting this holistically too. There's really no right or wrong way to do this. Again, it's kind of like the recipes that you follow related to making food. You could always add your own style and flair, but this presupposes you're focusing on one specific workload.
Mm-hmm. Identity-based controls, platform encryption services.
Data at rest and transit.
Yep.
What about your virtual disk? You want to encrypt those?
Let's leave that one off.
Okay.
Right now. See what it does.
Okay. It's interesting. Like it's interesting giving you kind of the idea of how to do it, right? So in a cloud, so how are you managing identity for this workload? Probably a single enterprise directory, right?
Yeah, probably. Yep. Synchronize identity, right?
Yep.
If we want to think about it, probably most of the environments are hybrid identity environment.
Oh yeah, definitely. We can enforce conditional access, right? You can only access it at a certain spot. Mm-hmm. Let's see. We probably have an identity strategy.
Yep.
That's probably decent. Let's see. We got 2 more to go through here. So, how have you secured the network for your workload? Let's see. Maybe a security containment strategy.
Internet edge strategy.
Which one was that one? Let's see.
It's
the next one, right?
Right before none of the above.
Oh, okay. All right. What do you think? Leave it with
network segmentation. Let's use network segmentation. Second one.
Okay. And we'll move forward here. We've got a couple, I think we've got what, one or two more. So what trade-offs do you need to make to meet your security goals? You want to maybe contain the attacker access. Maybe build appropriate level of resilience into your security infrastructure.
Sounds good.
That sounds good. And this is the very last question. In fact, it's going to give you this on each one of the assessments. If you've filled this out, it's going to show up as a kind of like a, it's kind of red-ish. Like the text is definitely red, but it's, you know, make sure you fill it out. So how are you ensuring your critical accounts are protected? Let's say we could establish a life cycle management policy. Appropriate emergency access accounts are configured, so your break glass accounts.
Yep.
We can probably leave it at that. What do you think?
Yep. Let's leave it at that for now.
Okay, so then you go through submit, and you send it into the engine here, churning away. So now you see you've got this awesome cover sheet, so to speak. You can export this to CSV. You'll see that your overall results, you land in the moderate category. And again, you can always rerun this at any point. But the idea here is you get this awesome way to think about improving your results. So when you click on show more, you've got all of these interesting links, and they'll take you into the framework itself, which then links you into how to configure it or things to think through in order to build this better for you so that you match all of the well-architected framework kind of requirements, so to speak. You're, you know, moderate. So we're moderate for performance efficiency. So we, you know, choose the right database to match the usage, right? Manage the load on your databases, right? Use the content delivery network. So these are kind of some cool ways to think about, you know, your environment. You can always come back to this too, right? So, you know, you can always assess operational excellence or reliability, but this is an evolution. And it's pretty straightforward to go through. Like, I mean, prior to these assessments, I would spend months with customers trying to get them to think about each one of their environments, each one of their security controls, their business unit requirements, the different applications that they had. You can run specific applications through this well-architected framework and get an idea on how to make this environment better. So you reach that point where you're over here in the excellent side. So yeah, that's kind of the well-architected review.
Yeah, that's really cool. Very helpful there.
And I don't know if you had to do a lot of that prior to as well, Dwayne, but these assessments really are helping speed up the process.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because yeah, it does put you in the mode, and you're thinking now about how all of that is going to affect your environment and affect your workload.
Correct.
Like you said, you can look at that workload, and you can look and even before maybe you move that workload, you can now start thinking about how and what you need to take into account as you're architecting, as you're creating, as you're standing up and migrating workloads. You know, all of those areas that you should consider as you adopt your cloud framework and adopt Azure for your workloads. So let's talk about one of those pieces in specifically, and that's around cost optimization and what kind of tools and things to think about in this area as we go through our well-architected framework. And obviously, optimizing costs is one of is a key driver in cloud adoption, and how we go about doing that, and how we go about building our environment to optimize costs and optimize cost capabilities is a key thing. And as we saw going through that assessment, a key pillar as well. So what do we want to do as we go into looking at optimizing costs? And some of the key things here, are we want to look at and conduct our strategies properly, and we want to have an engagement on how we're going to manage and optimize our costs and become more efficient within our Azure footprint. It's not a one size fits all when we move workloads to Azure. It's a continued process on how we're going to understand our environments and how our workloads act within Azure, and properly then forecast cost initially so that we don't go and blow out our budget immediately, But then how do we continue to move forward, and how do we continue then to optimize resources and utilize those resources? And we'll talk about a couple of those tools. Obviously, we went through one in terms of the well-architected framework assessment. We can look at how what we're utilizing within there for that. We're going to talk in a few slides about Azure Advisor. Azure Policy is another tool within there that can help us then also control our costs and put things in place and utilize. There's actually a policy or initiative around the cloud adoption framework within policy that we can utilize and implement those different policies and implement proper best practices to optimize cost. We can identify locations and workloads, and virtual machine SKUs that we allow within our environment to control our budgets as well. So all of those things, there's many tools within the Azure environment that can help us to optimize costs and what we want to do in terms of optimizing costs. And when we look at that cost optimization, we look at it kind of in a cyclical motion of, we're going to collect, and identify, like I said, we're going to move a workload to the environment. We're going to have an initial estimate on what that's going to cost probably. But then, we want to continue to analyze and review that on a continual basis. We want to, we want to make sure that what we estimated, we're not going over that estimate, but then we also want to look at that workload and what the utilization is of that workload and find ways to optimize that workload once we get it into the Azure environment. And then that's where we start looking at the tools that can advise us on that. Again, Azure Advisor, utilize and what policies we might want to put in place, best practice recommendations. And then as we go through those and we maybe implement some of those recommendations that are utilized with those cost optimization tools, we need to then review those results and then again plan to review and gather more information as we continue to go along and find new ways to optimize it. Maybe it's maybe as we go along and we see that our workload is performing at a pretty stable level. There's no real spikes and dips in its performance on a monthly basis. Maybe we find that utilizing reserved instances is a good way to save quite a bit of money within our environment to optimize our costs for that. Maybe it's moving, building lifecycle management in our storage account for moving old documents from hot to cool storage and then to archive. Building those different policies in place that are going to then continue to optimize our environment. And then we look at this all in three different categories. When we're looking at our cost optimization, there's from an organizational level, which really is our business, our business costs, what we budgeted within our departments for our cloud spend, and looking at all of that. Then there's the architectural, with when we're looking at the pillars for well-architected framework or even the cloud adoption framework, where we're optimizing those, how the environment is architected and is it modernizing workloads to optimize costs as well. And then there's the tactical approach. Are we needing to move workloads to different locations for compliance and governance, and maintaining them and evaluating which regions are best suited for our workloads from a data sovereignty standpoint, as well as a cost standpoint. And then I think, Shannon, you're going to bring us through some of those capabilities around around the cost management and the visualizations and capabilities that are within the Azure environment.
Right. So when you think about leaning on Azure Cost Management and you think about leaning on the Billing Power BI app, you get a number of sort of pre-canned reports that you can just use as is, or you can add additional pieces into the mix here and make it be much more kind of custom tailored for you. The account overview really just shows a monthly summary of everything, including charges against credits, new purchases, Azure Marketplace charges, as well as overages and total charges. The usage by subscriptions and resource group, it really does just provide a cost over time where you can view all of the different charts showing cost by subscription or cost by resource group. Then there's the usage by services, so it provides a view over time related to the meter category. So you can track your usage data and drill into any anomalies to understand usage spikes or dips. The top 5 usage drivers is a report that shows a filtered cost summarization by using the top 5 meter category and corresponding meter names. So that just showcases the top 5 resources or top 5 workloads that might make more sense to pay attention to. You can also think about using the Windows Server Azure Hybrid Benefit Usage Report. This will show the number of virtual machines that had the Azure Hybrid Benefit enabled. It will also show a count of cores per vCPUs used by those virtual machines. The report will identify Windows VMs where the Hybrid Benefit is enabled, and there are less than, say, 8 vCPUs, as well as where the Hybrid Benefit is not enabled, and you have 8 or more vCPUs on the server itself. So having this information becomes helpful to fully utilize your hybrid use benefit. From there, the RI chargeback, it'll show you where and how much of a reserved instance benefit is applied per region, per subscription or resource group. This report shows kind of usage data to kind of show that holistic view. You can filter on the charge type specifically as well. You'll understand any sort of RI underutilization data. The RI savings, this is a report that shows kind of the accrued by reservations for subscription, resource group, and the resource level. The VM RI coverage, it'll show a kind of a shared recommendation. So this report is split between on-demand VM usage and RI VM usage over the selected period. It provides kind of recommendations for the VM RI purchases at a shared scope. The VM RI coverage, it'll be a single recommendation, so it will split between on-demand VM usage and RI VM usage over the selected time period. So very similar to the shared recommendation, but it'll highlight individual VMs. RI purchases, it'll show the RI purchases over a specific period, so you can start to track that. That becomes really helpful as you build out what that 1 or that 3-year cycle looks like. And then the price sheet report will really just highlight a detailed list of prices specific to a billing account or an EA enrollment. The big piece here is you have to have an enterprise agreement subscription or an enterprise agreement. So let's move into the Azure Advisor. So this will help you related to kind of cloud optimization. So it's a personalized cloud consultant, right? It'll help you follow best practices to optimize your Azure deployments, not just in cost scope, but also security scope, utilization scope, etc. The cool piece here, though, is that you can think about shutting down unused VMs. You can right-size those VMs, and they'll actually show you why. Whereas sometimes we would just guess prior to this being in the world of Azure resources. This will also account for any environment where you can buy reserved instances just to help with consistency on price. And then you can delete things like idle network gateways, right? Sometimes customers have allowed certain folks the kind of a more robust access into their environment. So they have a sprawling type subscription. Azure Advisor will highlight anything that's not being used. And one of the things you can think about getting rid of is your idle network gateways. So you'll also think about leaning on the remediation steps as well. So just like what we saw with the well-architected assessment, you'll get the actual detailed guidance on how to configure correctly so that you live within the right parameters of having more of a realized kind of cost and that you can actually build out your budget month over month.
It's real interesting when you look at the 5 areas here, and if we go back and think about the pillars of the well-architected framework, there's a lot of consistency here.
Correct. Yep. And I don't know if that was, because I think Azure Advisor is older, but I wonder if well-architected framework kind of adopted similar facets and made it be something where you could go consume it with your business stakeholders, right? And then Azure Advisor will help your engineers make sure that everything matches up to that well-architected framework.
Exactly.
So when we think about, a cost-effective workload, it's really driven by business goals and the return on investment while staying within a given budget, right? So the principles of cost optimization are a series of important considerations that help you achieve both business objectives and cost justification. So as outlined here, there's a handful of principles that guide that cost optimization discussion within the well-architected framework. Keep within the cost constraints, aim for scalable costs, pay for consumption, use the right resources, use the right size, as well as monitor and optimize kind of as you move forward from left to right. There are also some design principles as well. That follows suit with cost modeling, choosing the right resource, evaluating the cost in various regions. I don't know if you want to flip it forward, Dwayne. I think I'm kind of on.
It seems to be a little bit of delay.
Oh, okay. All right. Hey, no worries. So just know that when you're evaluating cost and say you're figuring out cost modeling, you're choosing the right resources, you're evaluating cost in various regions. You're reserving capacity where you need it. It's not just VMs. You could reserve capacity for storage. This all helps reduce OpEx cost, helps you plan out what that month by month is going to look like. You could use managed services, so anything that doesn't really require you to care and feed. So that could be something like anything in the PaaS layer, right? So think of managed services as those type of services where you're not having to manage outright. And then from a provision perspective, there's also kind of a time cost as well, right? So with the advent of cloud, many enterprises don't want engineers to take days to provision resources. So you could think about speeding up the time cost here by deploying resources from a centralized artifact repository, whether that be ARM templates, Terraform templates, PowerShell scripts, AZ-CLI scripts, right? So there's ways in which to enhance the agility here, and you're able to then deploy and continue to increase your momentum in terms of cloud adoption. When I think about kind of monitoring as well, so leaning on the Azure Cost Management and the Power BI app, these things are tools that come in to help, as well as Azure Advisor. So, having all this data accounted for visually helps you determine what's the most helpful and where any gaps are if they exist. So by using native tooling, you have capacity to require, say, tagging of resources upon resource creation, an ability to audit resources, which kind of highlight when a resource exists without a proper tag, for example. You also have an ability to create cost alerts that sort of detect anomalies. This all becomes helpful if a specific business group is consuming too much on a day-to-day basis, or maybe they're deploying the wrong resources. Some way, somehow, it'll help you identify where these anomalies exist. So leaning on Azure, you have all these native tools to help you operationalize the well-architected framework and sort of breathe life into the mix here related to your Azure-based applications. When we think about optimization, you'll probably want to optimize or remove underutilized resources, although you may not know about those resources as they're being built, right? So this tends to be something you'll analyze after the fact for the most part. A lot of times enterprises start to sprawl, so Azure Advisor helps in that instance. You can take action on cost reviews, you can resize VMs, you can remove resources, change SKUs, etc. You can also think about using discount prices. So the reserved instances, AHub licensing, that is really important with certain types of workloads, especially workloads that live in the VM space. There's also, sort of the on-demand auto scale up, but then you can auto scale back when the heavy peak time has passed. So a big piece here is to reevaluate design choices periodically as well. So new features come out very quickly with Azure. It's very hard for us at Microsoft to even keep up, let's be honest. So there may be a new VM SKU or a new PaaS resource that you might want to take advantage of. So these are ways to think about, continuing to optimize from a cost perspective, is to make sure that that iteration happens on a periodic basis where you're taking a look at the Azure service or services that could potentially make up your workload. And then we covered a very similar looking slide earlier. So, some businesses or cost decisions definitely influence the workload or architecture decisions. So, you want to think about maybe all of your dev environments living in a dev test subscription. You can start to really understand the full value of what that workload will look like without having to pay the premium to run it inside of a production environment out the gate, right? So you build up the skill set, you start to figure out where the trade-offs are, and you're able to think about leaning on the dev test subscription for your development workloads, which then lead you into your mission critical workloads, where those environments are probably staying on and they're staying up and they're resilient. So that's where your A-Hub licensing will come into the mix, right? You have to figure out at what point it makes sense to take use of to make use of those discounts. And then from there, reserved instances. So you can use that for a plethora of different services now. Storage is the one I'm fairly familiar with recently, just having played around with it a little bit. So it's not just VMs, but VMs are very commonly what customers wind up leaning on. But you have to balance that out with, does it make sense to lean on that if that VM is going to be around for a long time? And most likely, if it's going to be living in your world for a long time, you probably want to take advantage of that related to kind of the cost optimization factor. And you probably also want to make sure that every single workload is secure or follows a security baseline. And maybe that doesn't really matter in your dev test workloads. That's where you can experiment to kind of get it to where it needs to be. But by the time it reaches, staging or production, you'll want to make sure it really adheres to all of the policies within your organization. So you'll have to always balance the costs with the trade-off as you think about building out the well-architected framework within your environment.
All right, that brings us to the end of this episode of our Azure Well-Architected Framework. We got you back into the cloud adoption framework and the governance model within that, within CAF, and then kind of flowed you into then how that starts to build our well-architected framework, and how then we can utilize those pillars of the well-architected framework to start building our review and to analyze our environment and how we're architecting and deploying our workloads within Azure, and then what we need to do then to continue to look at one of those pillars, which is the cost optimization, but important to take all of those into consideration as we're going through our review and continuing to optimize our workloads within the environment. And we'll continue to look at more and more of these operational efficiencies as Shannon and I continue our little series of episodes around architecting the architecture frameworks within Azure. So we will close things out now at this point. And I appreciate everybody listening to this Thinking Cloudy episode on the well-architected framework. And my name is Dwayne Natwick.
I'm Shannon Keene.
And we want to thank you for attending this Skill Me Up episode. You can find past and future episodes on skillmeup.com. And you can also view past episodes become available usually a few weeks after we have recorded them onto the Skill Me Up YouTube channel for public consumption. So hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks.